Mr. Karber, welcome to our program. You have visited the front line in eastern Ukraine many times. How would you describe the current situation there?
Well, it's stable in the sense that the front line doesn't move very much. They're shooting every day. And the level of shooting at the end of August was the third highest peak in the last 30 months.
Really?
Yeah, it almost equaled the amount of shooting that was involved when the Russians attacked in the summer of 2014 and in the winter offensive. So that raised a lot of concerns. And at the same time, the Russians were doing this very large exercise in the Black Sea, doing large amphibious operation, an air operation, and also practicing a large land invasion east of Rostov. So the combination of the spike in violence and this large Russian exercise raised a lot of concerns.
What's your explanation on that? Why you think it is so?
You know, I've only been able to anticipate Putin twice in the last 30 months. And both times I predicted an invasion and it happened. So I stopped predicting because it's like bad karma. I think they are taking conflict with Ukraine and also with NATO extremely seriously. And they're organizing and preparing and testing their forces for a potential conflict. And that, I think we ought to take that seriously as well.
Your name was popping up in the leaked emails of former NATO commander Philip Breedlove, and as I understand, you confirmed the authenticity of this correspondence, right?
I confirmed that the correspondence took place.
Okay, was it that you tried to find some, let's call it secret ways how to move the weapons to the Ukraine without direct involvement of the U.S. government?
No, I think if somebody looks at the, first of all, let me say the Russians did not, I repeat, did not release all the correspondence. They selectively released correspondence. So if you just look at what was released, you get a somewhat distorted picture. Most of the correspondence they didn't release would have been embarrassing to them. For example, I sent General Breedlove the Russian invasion plan, and they didn't bother to, they haven't released that one. No, General Breedlove was interested in my observations because of the potential implications for NATO forces. So we were looking at Russian use of electronic warfare, Russian use of unmanned aerial vehicles, the new Russian tank, the T-90, with this active defense on it, the large-scale use of Russian artillery and scatterable munitions, while NATO is getting rid of all of its scatterable munitions because of the Princess Di Convention. So there were a lot of observations that General Breedlove was interested in. The reason, other than we were friends, the reason he encouraged me to send those is because there was a ban, basically by US and almost all NATO countries, from sending any military observers to the front. So in 177 days there, I never once met in the combat zone a US military official, or frankly, a NATO official, or a military guy. So while NATO had lots of intelligence and satellite imagery and so forth, they didn't have anybody really reporting on the ground. So General Breedlove encouraged me to send him my observations. One of those observations was the Ukrainians desperately needed anti-tank weapons. They needed new communications gear because the Russians were using electronic warfare very effectively against them. They needed a counter-battery radar so that they could see where the Russian radars, where the Russian artillery was firing from. They needed some drones because the Russians were using unmanned aerial vehicles or drones everywhere over them. It was a very unequal contest. So of 5 areas of weakness that we identified, only one was a lethal weapon. And by the way, all 4 of the other systems the U.S. sent. So, ultimately. So, I reject the argument that we were sort of conspiring behind Obama's back or the administration. I think the administration was slow to realize, having been at the front, which they weren't, I think the administration was slow to realize the military significance of the conflict and the importance of not letting Ukrainians collapse. Over time, they've responded, and so they've sent communications equipment, they've sent counter-battery radar, they've sent Raven unmanned aerial vehicles. They haven't sent lethal weapons because they're trying not to escalate the conflict. I happen to disagree with that, and I've told them that in meetings at the White House, State Department, Pentagon. But there was nothing behind the scenes other than at the same time that I was sending those messages to General Breedlove, I was sending them also to the White House and particularly to the State Department, Defense Department.
You took Breedlove to the front line.
Yeah, yes, just after he retired, yes, 2 weeks ago, just got back.
What were your observations?
Well, let me give you his. We were with the Ukrainian airborne and air assault troops who've done probably the majority of, or a disproportionate amount of the effective fighting. And his quote was, the troops and commanders that I saw are some of the best in NATO, compared to the best in NATO. He was very impressed. Ukraine has gone through a really, not only 30 months of war, and it's amazing. When I first arrived in Ukraine in March of 2014, most people predicted, well, they'll put in a defense for 48 hours and they won't be able to sustain it. They've been at the front now for 30 months of fighting. The Ukrainians have shot more artillery because they'd inherited a large stock of it, ammunition from the former Soviet Union. They have shot more artillery ammunition than exists in all of the armies of NATO on the continent. I mean, you think about that. I mean, it's just, you take France, Germany, Poland, all that ammunition, and they shot that much. So it's been a violent, high-intense war. When the conflicts first started, they could only field 10 battalions that were combat effective, were ready. Today they have 66. They started the war with 14 brigades, most of which weren't ready. Today they have 22 brigades in the field with commanders who are all combat trained, and the majority of the troops have had combat experience. It is the toughest, strongest army west of Russia today. And you can compare it favorably to any other army in NATO. It's not the most modern. They have a lot of old Russian equipment, a lot of equipment that's 30 years old. But that today is the best trained and best commanded army on this continent, outside of Russia.
You mentioned Russia's intervention plan in Ukraine. I don't know if it particular you mentioned in the spring this year that you got, and then you said that there are some I don't know, chapters or some quotes regarding Baltic states. Yeah. What is said there about the Baltic states?
So we only have about 130 pages of what appears to be about a 300-page war plan. The plan was put together by the Western Military District, and it's a draft, so it wasn't the final plan, but it was a draft. And what's interesting is the plan is very specific. It lays out specific units going on specific roads, certain timetables and so forth, very specific. By the way, the Russians lined up those exact units on the border with Ukraine. So this wasn't just a hypothetical plan, this was a plan for forces that had been moved and put in place. What's interesting is there was an annex. As most war plans, there's a general description of the plan, and then there's a whole series of annexes. So there'll be an annex on information war, an annex on deception, an annex on electronic warfare, special operations, air operations, so forth. Well, there's an annex on targeting. And in that targeting list were literally hundreds of targets in Ukraine. And buried in there were targets in the Baltic. Now, my assumption is that they, and this is an assumption because we don't have the all the annexes to the plan, but they had probably.
What was it, the original document?
Yeah, it's an original document, but we don't have all of it. And the listing of the targets, I believe the ones that reflected Baltic targets were probably associated with a contingency plan. So if the war in Ukraine got out of hand, then a contingency would be to invade the Baltic. I can't imagine them wanting to attack the Baltics at the same time as Ukraine. It's, to me, just appears stupid, but it was very clear there were Baltic targets there, and I believe that was probably a contingency. We know Putin has said that when he invaded Crimea initially, he put his forces on nuclear alert. Right? And we know they did that, including alerting their ballistic missile submarines at sea, which they hadn't done in 20 years. So clearly they were thinking about contingency plans, and I think my belief is that one aspect of that was would include operations in the Baltic. But certainly the target list was there.
I understand that you are not sharing the opinion that Russia could take Riga in, I don't know, 3 days, or as like expert Zbigniew Brzezinski put it, like literally in 1 day. Why do you think it would take much longer for Russia to I don't know, even took Riga?
Well, so if you look at the forces immediately available to the Baltic area, the Russians have the 6th Army up by Leningrad, opposite Estonia, and they have the 76th Guards Air Assault Division, 2 big brigades, very near the Latvian Estonian border. To invade all the Baltics, they would have to move more forces into Belarus, which is they've done in exercises in the Zapad exercises of 1999, 2009, 2013. And those exercises involved invading the Baltics and eastern Poland, all the way to Vistula, doing strikes in Poland and throughout the Baltic. But those forces aren't there in peacetime. So if they're going to invade all of the Baltics, not just Estonia or northern part of Latvia, you have to move these forces into Belarus. Well, that takes time and it's visible. If the NATO countries just sit and watch that happen and don't react, that's a large force that could overrun people fairly quickly. If the governments of the Baltic, Poland, and NATO reciprocally respond to this Russian deployment, so they bring up reserves, move people to the front, bring in reinforcements. It's a much tougher, it's not an easy fight for the Russians. So that's one issue I have is I think it is misleading to imply that the Russians can do this whole thing and everybody's sitting here as if and unready. I mean, that could happen, but that's because of stupid political decisions, not military balance. Prudent planners, prudent political response will be reciprocal. So that's the first point. A second point is a lot of civilian analysts who do these war games, you know, the RAND Corporation did a little war game on a table. They go, oh, you can move here in 60 hours. You can't drive a tank from the Russian border to Riga in 60 hours unopposed. I mean, let alone people trying to stop you. I mean, if you live in this country, there's swamps, there's forests, the roads are narrow. Now, it is true if those narrow paths are not defended, you can make a penetration. And to defend all of them, you'd need to mobilize your forces and you'd need NATO help and reinforcements. But the idea that you can just sort of run over this place in 60 hours, I think is simplistic and uninformed. I mean, I think it's silly. That doesn't mean you couldn't have an air assault operation where they try to land guys right here in Riga the first day. It doesn't mean you won't have airstrikes. But to do that and do it and successfully, they're going to have to bring additional forces. And so if you have a prudent response, then you should be able to offset that force. That's why I think it's the terrain here is the most defensible terrain anywhere in Europe. So if there's troops there to defend it. In peacetime, the military establishments of the Baltics are small, so they can't defend every gap. But if they raise those forces in proportion to the Russians moving their forces closer to the border, then that terrain becomes is defended and is very defensible. And it's going to be a very, very tough fight for the Russians to push through it.
It makes sense, meaning that forces are not moving on the table or on the map, but in the real terrain. Do you really think that, I don't know, lakes, rivers, swamps, dense forests are the factor that might even stop Russian forces moving very fast?
If you have people defending the roads that go through them. If you don't, then no, you can drive down them at, rate of 30 kilometers an hour or something, and move in. But again, those to get forces adjacent to 2/3 of Latvia, the Russians have to move forces into Belarus. To get forces opposite Lithuania from the east side, because Kaliningrad doesn't have enough force to hold Kaliningrad and take over Lithuania, you have to bring additional forces into Belarus. So, we should be watching that. It takes time for them to move those forces, and NATO should have, and the Baltic republics, each country should have plans to reciprocally respond. So if they bring 10 brigades in, we increase the Baltic defense by at least 10 battalions. Combination of mobilization and reinforcement. If they bring in 20, we have to have the ability to add more. One thing that is very disturbing is the Russians have just recreated, because they used to have tank armies. They just recently formed the 1st Guards Tank Army. And it sits west of Moscow, sort of between Moscow and Smolensk. That army can be fairly rapidly, and it's still in process. It hasn't completed the modernization and equipping and manning of it yet. But that army could be used against the Baltics. It could be used, move down to Brest and threaten Warsaw, or it could swing south and invade Ukraine from the northeast. That's a very powerful formation. It has 800 tanks, 1,500 armored personnel carriers, 500 tubes of artillery, and the most dense mobile radar-directed air defense of any force in the world. So that's a very powerful fist. There is no single NATO country that fields a force equivalent to that. So we need to watch that very carefully, and we need to watch where they deploy it. So if they start bringing it into Belarus for an exercise, NATO is going to need, and the Baltic Republic is going to need to respond.
Do you think our Latvian military staff has such knowledge to use this terrain factor for Latvia properly? Absolutely.
I've spent time with your Minister of Defense, Bergmans, General Graba, your Chief of Defense. I've met and spent hours, weeks with most of your planners and all the brigade and battalion commanders. I've met almost every brigade and battalion commander, some of them on their terrain, they're defending. I think you have one of the most professional, aware military and ready, psychologically ready military forces in NATO. I've been very impressed with Latvian defense. You're a small country, and so you have a small army, and you depend on mobilization. So one of the challenges that you're going to have is it's going to be a very difficult political decision for your political leaders, is if the Russians start mobilizing and re-employing forces, is to take the tough decision to, okay, let's call up some reserves, let's move guys to the front, so they're in position to cover that terrain. But in terms of knowledge of the terrain, defense tactics, you're getting your money's worth with your new investment in equipment, including the Scorpion armored vehicles, adding additional self-propelled artillery and air defense. You're going to quit. Your army is going to acquit itself very well.
In the simulation games that organization you represent conducted to Latvian Ministry of Defense, there are one serious dilemma occurred whether to protect capitals of the Baltic states in the case of some aggression, or whether to protect the borders, which is much harder to do. But as I understand, that Russia's goal might be to take the ports near the Baltic Sea and especially make a corridor to the Kaliningrad. How we must solve this dilemma to protect the capitals, the governments from the possible overthrow, or protect the borders?
I don't think it's an either-or choice. So you have to protect your capital. That's the center of your political will. That's the organizing area for any defense, right? So you don't have a choice. You have to protect your capital. With countries with small military, the active force initially is going to be for that role. But if you look at the terrains, the most defensible terrain for Estonia and Latvia is forward, not back. Lithuania's capital is right on the border of Belarus, so it's within artillery range of fire from artillery. So you have this conundrum. If Estonia protects Tallinn, but leaves the gap open in southern Estonia, Latvian forces can be outflanked. If Latvia defends half the country but not forward, it opens the gap to Lithuania.
Is the problem for all three countries, right?
It's almost a cascading effect. Each country is dependent on its defense is dependent on the success and willingness of their neighbor country. And all three of the Baltics are dependent on Poland because NATO's line of supply and reinforcement comes through Poland. So, and this is why the decisions at Warsaw were so important. Because you can't bankrupt your country and have a large standing army all the time. So each country, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, have made compromises, because they have to, between ready forces, total mobilization force size, and modernization. So you spend money and effort on all these figures. So what's important is with NATO adding these battalions and having the ability to bring in additional brigades behind them, you now can defend those gaps. So the Russians know, and may only go, oh, well, on this road, there's only a company or on a major area, a battalion protecting it. The Russians go, well, that means I can't run over it with a small force. I got to add more force. So that means they have to bring in additional reinforcements. Those reinforcements come from farther away. They come by train and by road, and they should be seen. As NATO watches those forces assembling on the border, that gives the countries and NATO unambiguous warning to take additional precautions and make that defense even harder. So our conclusion was that the area is very defensible, and you win or lose the security of the Baltics on the margin. It's not an issue of mass Russian attack, because you can't bring masses of forces through these woods and swamps. So they're automatically channelized into narrow sectors. So the key is to be able to have enough force in peacetime ready to block those, and then have a mobilization and reinforcement potential to add stuff that they would have to bring in to offset it. So I think that was an enormous decision and very constructive one at Warsaw to send these battalions, a battalion each, to cover those help cover those critical gaps.
But anyway, we can't escape the withdrawal from the border lines, right? From the Latvian border, from the Estonian border.
Well, I think that with mobilization, I think you can defend those defensible forward areas. I would, and I think because the terrain is tougher there for offensive, it gives you more depth. You know, the alternative is if you end up only defending the capitals, as you sacrifice 70% of your country gets overrun, you compromise your neighbor's security, and even if you hold your capital area, how long are you going to hold it until NATO reinforcement has to fight its way back up? So I think it's really important to be able to have that forward defense, and it is affordable if your allies are willing to put some active ready forces to help you have that in peacetime. You know, eventually I think it'd be prudent to get some additional heavy forces. There's not a single tank in any of the armies of Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania. And while this isn't what you think of as tank country, tanks are still the best anti-tank weapon, and if the attacking force makes a penetration, you have to be able to counterattack it. Otherwise, your light infantry who are dug in are going to be outflanked and outran and sacrificed. So eventually, I think a prudent defense plan ought to look at ways either Allied armored forces being able to come quickly, or making available through Lend-Lease access to some heavier armor, and frankly also some additional air defense.
In the first simulation game you played with the Latvian army, you played a scenario when Latvia tried to defend itself by using the current available forces, and the result was that National Guard quickly lost about 80% of its assets. Isn't it unusual to use such a volunteer organization as a first liners in the front?
You don't have a choice. And that's why it's important that they have good training. And when they train in the regular force and then go into the reserve, the evidence is that people who have had excellent training keep that training fresh and are able to go back quickly for a good 4 or 5 years after that, when they're in the reserves. So I think that's important. Again, having allied forces also with you really helps, because they bring NATO TAC air to the fight, both for air cover to prevent Russian Air Force from dominating our own skies, and also being able to attack Russian columns that are trying to penetrate. So I think that volunteers and mobilized guys can provide an effective defense if they're backed up with active forces who are screening the front, give them time to get in position and dig in, and then the active and with some armor goes in reserve and can counterattack any danger of penetration.
How would you rate the equipment National Guard have right now?
They need more. You are in the process of building additional National Guard units, and so you're going to need more equipment to equip them. I've been impressed. I think you have a decent air defense system you've been buying. You're going to be buying some long-range artillery and some multiple rocket launchers. I think that would be very good. The one gap is, I think the major gap is probably, you have some good anti-tank weapons, and they're good for this, this terrain because they have a top attack capability. So the one area that I personally believe, and I'm not arguing with anybody in your government, but if it was me, I would, at least in longer range plans, think about getting some heavier armor, some tanks, basically. What the war in Ukraine has shown is the tank is still alive and well. And it's also demonstrated that infantry dug in Ukraine, Ukrainian infantry who are dug in are inflicting 6 times as many casualties on Russian attacking guys coming in, 6 times. However, if they get outflanked, it flips around, and then they lose 6 times more than the attacker. So you can put in, with modern weaponry, you can put in a very strong defense that inflicts very heavy losses on an attacker. But you have to have a counterattack force, because there's always the contingency he breaks through someplace. And you need to be able to cut that off. You need to be able to take the initiative away from him. One of the interesting things in the simulations we demonstrated is your commanders know this terrain better than, like the back of their hand. They're better than anybody else in NATO, and certainly better than the Russians do. So they know where the forest trail is to sneak through and do an armored attack. They know which bridge to blow so that Russian units get caught in a trap. They know where there's good ground, a road goes by a swamp, but you got a clear killing ground. So if you put your tanks or anti-tank weapons along that, you can attack that column and they can't turn around and maneuver against you because it's a swamp. And that's the advantage of having such a really superior group of military guys who are thinking about defending their country. I'm frankly impressed.
What about Poles? If I'm correct, Poles involved in this simulation delayed or refused to take collective action. Isn't it something like an alarming signal?
No. In a number of simulations, when you do a simulation, you try to hold variables tight. So we just assumed the Poles were not playing in the simulation, and we assumed that on some of the scenarios that the United States was willing to put more force into the various republics. I would not read anything into that. The Poles themselves have a debate, or have a tough challenge, just like you have a challenge about defending your capital versus defending forward, right? So the Russians moved this tank army into Western Belarus, right? Very similar to what they've done in these exercises. That gives time to build the defenses in the Baltic. The Poles and the Americans are then, and NATO reinforcements are then going to try to swing up and help defend the Baltics. But Warsaw's sitting there with this tank army aimed at it. And so that's going to draw Polish concern, and we need to be thinking about that as well, because it doesn't help to come rushing to the Baltic defense and then have, and by the way, this is exactly what the Russians did in 1944 after the attack against the German Army Group Center. As they approached Warsaw, they then swung in behind the Germans and basically isolated all the German forces in the Baltic. They've done that with tanks on that terrain before. They can read their own history as well as we can. So we need to simultaneously be able to protect that Belarusian corridor. And there's 2 ways of doing that. One is to have a more rapid and heavier NATO force reinforcing in Poland, not just limited to reinforcements for the Baltic. And secondly, politically, start engaging Belarus. Almost every paragraph I've mentioned when we talk about the Russian threat, I have the word Belarus in it. You cannot threaten all of the Baltics and Poland without going through Belarus. So you go, maybe we should be engaging them a little more. You know, Europe in its political sense, and I'm not defending Lukashenko. He is what he is. He's certainly not a Democrat, okay? And he's not a West European Democrat. But isolating him merely throws him into the Russian hands. He's made some very strong statements recently about defending Ukraine and about not wanting, the Russians were putting heavy pressure on him to station forces there, and so far he's resisted that. I mean, there's some Russian air elements, but not ground. I think that ought to be rewarded and encouraged. You know, it's in our interest, it's in your interest, it's in NATO's interest to see a Belarus that's independent and not a freeway for Russian forces. The same is true, by the way, for Ukraine. You know, for the last 30 months, we in the West have had sanctions on Russia, right? The most effective sanction, the most powerful sanction, hasn't been against Russia. It is a virtual, complete embargo on giving the victim of attack any lethal weapon to defend themselves. The analogy I use is, imagine a woman is walking down the street and a group of thugs grab her and pull her into an alley, and she screams for help. And the people across the street looking at her and, well, we don't want to get involved. Well, we don't want to make it worse. And so she says, throw me a can of mace. And the people standing there go, well, no, if we give her the can of mace, the attackers may have a knife, it'll just make it escalate. I mean, if you think about it, our logic is specious. And my personal belief is that victims of aggression need the right. They have the right and need to be defended. Now, why should we care? Because Ukraine offers NATO more than NATO offers Ukraine. And I'm not talking about necessarily joining the alliance, but the best defense right now for the Baltics is the Russians being tied up in Ukraine. The minute that war is over, or if Ukraine collapses, all those Russian forces are available to do similar actions elsewhere. Right now, if the Russians commit that First Guards Tank Army to the Baltic or to Belarus, well, then they don't have it to invade Ukraine. So having a strong Ukraine that's independent and Western oriented is everybody. I mean, the people we count, East European, NATO, United States. It's in our strategic interest, and we ought to recognize that.
Mr. Karber, thank you very much.